Okay, James Goldie's speech, and now to finish the substantial portion of the affirmative team speeches, we have the third speaker, Tom.
In this debate, it was true that our model resulted in a democracy where the army would retain a large amount of power. They would retain the ability to get rid of that government whenever they liked. They would retain control over institutions like the courts. It was also true that it was wrong for the army to engage in a coup, that the tyranny of the majority wasn't a good enough reason to get rid of the Morsi government. The fact that Monash put most of their case on those two premises didn't prove anything, because those two facts were true in either world. It was always going to be true that the army was going to be able to control Egypt. The question was how we could coax them into supporting democracy anyway. That was what this debate was really about. And so for Monash to just harp on about the evils of the continuation of army interference in democracy wasn't good enough. I'm going to ask two questions briefly. Is our model legitimate? Does our model affect the Muslim Brotherhood positively or negatively? Before moving on to the substantive question in this debate, who gets better democracy in Egypt? Stephen told you at the start of this debate that our model wasn't legitimate because it was the tyranny of the majority. That was an attack on the coup and the way that it occurred, not our model. By making democracy more likely, we thought it was highly legitimate for the Muslim Brotherhood to do the things that we wanted them to do. Second question, what's in the best interest of the Muslim Brotherhood? Neither team in this debate thought that this was the most important question in this debate. It was obvious that the overbearing influences on everyone else in Egypt were always going to be an overbearing concern. Nonetheless, we thought we proved to you that the Muslim Brotherhood's interests were always overwhelmingly served by the fact that Egypt remained a democracy, even if it was an imperfect democracy that had military interference. We thought that if we could prove to you that that was something that was more likely under our model, we thought we proved a massive benefit for the Muslim Brotherhood. Nonetheless, they gave us a few reasons why the Muslim Brotherhood would lose support. First, they told us that our model would be perceived as the Muslim Brotherhood being hypocritical. We thought that the worst possible outcome in the perception of the people who supported the Muslim Brotherhood would be a return to a military dictatorship, because we were creating a very visible way in which the Muslim Brotherhood was combating that outcome. We thought that would make the base very happy with the decision that we were going to impose on them. Secondly, at Beavis' speech, they told you that the Muslim Brotherhood would lose patronage. They never told us why that patronage was especially important. We didn't think that money was the most important thing for the Muslim Brotherhood to go after. We also thought patrons like Qatar were likely to be highly rational, and therefore if they could observe the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood was gaining more power and more influence in Egypt as a result of our model, we thought they would continue to fund the Muslim Brotherhood. But furthermore, we told you right at the start of our case that there was a massive risk that the military would ban the Muslim Brotherhood under the status quo, that the continuation of violent protests just gave the army more and more of an excuse to do that. We thought that would obviously be in the worst possible interest of the Muslim Brotherhood, and perhaps more importantly, in the worst interests of Egyptian democracy, if the most organised political force in opposition to the army was something that wasn't able to operate legally. Substantive question in this debate. Who got better democracy in Egypt? There were two threads of argumentation. One concerning how we influenced the army to buy into that democracy, another concerning how we caused reconciliation between two polarised groups within Egypt. Monash told you, and the only time they ever told you, how they thought they could get a different way of causing the military to cooperate more with democratic principles, was that the people should protest on the streets in a way that challenged the military and challenged their interference in democracy. We have a couple of responses to why that didn't work. First of all, we think that the army has been willing in the past, during the Mubarak era, to violently put down protests if they think that that is in their interests. Therefore, if it was ever likely that the Muslim Brotherhood would be engaging in protests to the extent that was actually a threat to the military's power, we thought that gave the military a massive incentive to simply suppress those protests violently. That was obviously something that they had the power to do, given they had all of the guns and all of the money in Egypt in the real world. We also thought that we didn't actually need to extract those kinds of concessions from the military. Given that the only kinds of concessions that we could ever get from the military using that kind of highly public protest were highly public concessions, the most important one was for the military to agree to hold elections. That was something they've already agreed to do, which means that we didn't need protests as a mechanism in order to extract that particular concession out of the military. What we needed them to do was agree to give up power to the greatest extent possible and agree to interfere less with democracy. That was something that we couldn't extract concessions out of them with highly public protests, because it was the kind of thing that the military could do behind closed doors without anyone on the streets of Egypt ever really being aware of them. We told you that we gave the army massive incentives to cooperate more with democratic principles. We told you that we told you that the army was more likely to trust the Muslim Brotherhood. We told you that what our model represented was an important goodwill gesture. It was an important quid pro quo that traded the stability that was associated with an end to protests for some political power being given to the Muslim Brotherhood. We also thought it was bizarre for Beavis to claim that that was a coercive arrangement, given that the Muslim Brotherhood could presumably threaten to withdraw that arrangement under our model. We thought that it was something that was cooperative and that represented a good faith agreement by both sides. We also told you why it was particularly beneficial that that trust existed, which was something that we thought Monash papered over. Because it showed the Muslim Brotherhood that they could cooperate with the military, and it meant that the military was willing to trust the Muslim Brotherhood. They didn't think that they wouldn't, under our model, believe that the Muslim Brotherhood would threaten their interests if they were willing to cooperate with the army in this particular way. But more importantly, we created a process of overseeing institutions that allowed buy-in from both sides. We thought that in both models, the army would oversee the process by which things like a new Egyptian constitution were written. They had the power to do that. They obviously had a massive financial interest in ensuring that that happened. The difference was that by using our bargaining chip of protests, we ensured that the Muslim Brotherhood participated in that process as well. That was good for two really important reasons. Firstly, because there was more buy-in from a larger amount of people, we thought it would probably lead to better institutions. But secondly, and leading on to the next part of this argument, it meant that the legitimacy of those institutions, and crucially, the perceived legitimacy of those institutions, in the eyes of people who bought into the more Islamist side of Egyptian politics, was likely to be something that happened under our model. Beavis just asserted that the army wouldn't make concessions without explaining why, in the context of our model, the Muslim Brotherhood couldn't simply couldn't simply withdraw their original arrangement and cause instability to happen. The practical consequences of having cabinet seats meant that the Muslim Brotherhood would have the levers to ensure that they could impact that constitution. Even if the Muslim Brotherhood couldn't impact that constitution in practice, we thought that the optics of having them in government ensured that people would perceive they had impacted that constitution, which was the more important point in this debate. Because if people believed that those institutions were something that supported the ideology of a different group of people, it created the stability, it created the buy-in to the democratic process that was necessary for Egypt to change. We told you where the status quo was particularly problematic in terms of polarization. We told you that it was necessary for both halves of Egyptian politics to believe that the government was legitimate because they had control over different institutions, which meant that they could either overthrow the government or, in the best case scenario, make a government that they perceived to be illegitimate to be incredibly unstable. That was worsened by the optics of continued street violence in those countries. We changed that because we allowed both sides to buy into that government. We made those institutions to be perceived to be something that was supported by both sides, and we created a narrative of reconciliation between those two groups. The only response we ever heard to this was that we weren't likely to get reconciliation because specific groups that James Beavis had read about in The Economist were likely to be pissed off in highly specific ways. We thought this disputed the more general impact that this had on groups that were larger than the Salafists and that were larger than the Liberals. But we also thought that the optics of a grand coalition meant that people would believe that the majority of people in Egypt were represented. Furthermore, because we gave the army less of an incentive to interfere in the democratic process, less of an incentive to ban political parties in Egypt, we allowed those other groups to have their concerns adjudicated by an open democratic process to a greater extent than was ever possible under your case. Madam Speaker, we were the only team in this debate that gave you an actual mechanism that would work in order to make the army cooperate with Egyptian democracy. That was the most important thing in this debate we proposed.